Okay, this is the, I think, fourth video within our beginner AutoCAD series for drafting and design. And in this one, we're going to kind of build on the progress of the last couple of lessons and specifically talk about snapping and grip editing and how that relates to how we can move and tie into specific features. We're still going to be focusing mostly on lines, but by the end of this, we're going to move into polylines, which is kind of an extension of basic line features. Um, so first of all, we're just going to draw a few lines here, um, just to get something out here. Now, we mentioned before that, for example, if we wanted to draw a line emanating from the end of this line, that we could start a new line and we could zoom in really far and we could try to get it pretty close. Alright, okay, and so say we drew that there. But again, if we zoomed in, you notice there's still a gap. Now, you can try to move that over in different things. We can keep adjusting it, but even though you do that, there's still this gap. We still don't know 100% that that is exactly on that point. And that can become very important, especially things that need to be exact corners, exact, think about to be able to hold in a fluid or things like that. Okay, so the way we can do that, there's a couple different ways. One way, obviously, if we're drawing lines, and I turn on the ortho mode, so say we could draw and then we just continue drawing, okay, and we know that that is emanating from the previous point. Okay, but again, so say if I want to draw a square, it's hard to know exactly where that point is to come down and match it. All right, so what we can use is things called OSNAPs, or snapping. Now, you can generically turn on OSNAPs by hitting F3, and you see down here there's a little pick box. And object snapping, or OSNAP, is basically snapping the cursor to 2D reference points. If we pull up this little menu here, it shows we actually have a bunch of different options, and we're going to kind of work through these. Right now, when you turn on F3 or click this button down here, any of these that are checked will basically be available to you at any point in time. Okay, so the most common one you typically use is endpoint, and I'm going to show you that one real quick. So as we discussed before, say I want to draw a line that emanates exactly from the end of this line. So now that I have OSNAP turned on, I'm going to go L for line, and then now when I go to hover close, so you see this green box that pops up and it says endpoint. That is your object snapping, so it gives you this option to snap here. And so if I click, and even if I'm not right on there, and it actually kind of pulls your cursor in towards it, but as long as that green box is there, you click and it snaps to the exact point, end point of that line. So say I continue drawing and I want to come back and now come back to this end. See how it draws it in and it snaps. Now when we zoom in, we can zoom in forever and ever and ever, and those 2 points are exactly linked in 2D space. Okay, so if we think about just a basic line, what are the features of the line that we could snap to? And we'll kind of go through the list, but for any given line there are 2 endpoints on each end, so that's a point in space. It also has a midpoint, so halfway along this line there is a midpoint. So let me just show you some of these, and then we'll talk more about these in different lessons. But for circles, they have centers. For other shapes, there are geometric centers. A node is like a single point in space. Quadrants are useful for circular objects, and we'll get into some of these other ones. But for a single line, we essentially have endpoints, midpoints, but we can also snap perpendicular to the line, and that's pretty helpful. Or we can do nearest, and I'll kind of walk you through these. So let's just say now we can draw a line directly from this endpoint. Okay, and then I'm going to go turn a few of these options on here. We'll go nearest and perpendicular. Okay, so let's just say I want to go to the midpoint. Right here, this little triangle will pop up as an, here, let me turn the nearest off. That one gets a little confusing, but I'll talk about that in a second. So say I'm here and I want to go to the midpoint. When you have all of these turned on, it will give you multiple options depending on where you're located. So see, if I want to go to an endpoint, it gives me that option, and it's a little square. Same thing here. If I want to go to the midpoint, try to find kind of the middle. Now it pops up with this green little triangle, and that's the midpoint. Okay, of this line. Now every line has its own midpoint, if you see, and we can go from any direction and snap to the midpoint. Another option is, say I want a line that's absolutely perpendicular to this line. So we can just come out here in space, and now this symbol pops up, and it's kind of the right angle. If you think of this as two lines and then the right angle symbol, and now we can snap, and now this line is touching this line exactly, but at a 90-degree angle exactly to it. And this works for any angle of a line. You can keep moving it around and it'll find the exact point that is perpendicular to that point. So I'm going to turn this off real quick, these other ones off, and I'm going to show you this nearest. So sometimes we just need a point, a line to start from here. Now we don't always need it. We can send it somewhere else, but I just need it to start exactly on this line, but not necessarily at an end or midpoint or anywhere. So this little symbol comes kind of like the hourglass symbol, but it can slide up and down any point on this line, but the beginning of the line will be exactly on this line. You see how that works? So it's coming straight off of that line, and so I could also do that here. So if I wanted to make a triangle, I can put it exactly on this line as well. Now, as I mentioned before, if you just have all of these turned on at the same time, it can get really unwieldy, and it gives you all the options at once. And so sometimes that's kind of a pain. So what I normally do is I just leave endpoints turned on, because that's the most common one you will want to use, snapping thing. So I leave that turned on, and again, you can easily toggle your snaps on and off with F3. So normally, if I'm doing a lot of endpoints, then I'll just kind of go from there and snap between all of these. But say, even though I have that on, there's a special one I really want. Instead of going back down here, turning all that on, another option, so say I could start from this point, but say I want to snap to the midpoint of this line. Instead of clicking that one on, you can actually hit Shift and right click, and now it gives you a menu of all the different snaps, and you can just go in and pick a single one for that specific purpose. So now I'm going to hit midpoint, and then right here, and then I can end it. Okay, but that's only for that exact function, and it doesn't matter whether you have your snaps turned on or not. So I could actually turn OSNAP off, and I could do a same line. Say I wanted to start a line at this endpoint, I can shift right click, endpoint, say draw it out to here, shift right click, endpoint, shift right click, endpoint, shift right click, maybe we'll do the midpoint of this line. Okay, and so that's one way, and if you don't have a lot of snapping to do, sometimes that's an easier way. I generally prefer to keep my snaps on just as endpoints, and then anything other than that I'll do the shift right click. Now that we have all these lines drawn, another snap that we can use. So say I want to snap right to the intersection between these 2 points. So those aren't endpoints, it's not a midpoint, but it's an intersection. So there's an exact point in space that is. So say I start up here. If I shift right click, now there's actually 2 options for intersections, and I'll explain that in a second, but I'm just going to click intersection for now. And you see how it comes up and it's a little X. Now sometimes it has this little tracker to tell you you're getting close to an intersection, but this will get you to the exact point. And I could do the same thing, shift right click again, intersect. Okay, now the other option that popped up here, if you shift right click, is apparent intersect. Now it generally will give you a very similar result. It snaps to intersections. But this becomes really important when you're doing 3D modeling, or at least have things that have different elevations. Right now we are in a 2D space and we have not specified any Z coordinate or elevation. Everything just purely has XY coordinates, so it's on the exact same plane. So it's flat. So any 2 lines that cross will have an exact point in space, in 2D space, that it intersects. When we're doing 3D, sometimes maybe this line here is at 100 feet elevation and this line here is at 200 feet elevation, but as far as looking in plan view, there is an intersection point in space, but in 2D space. And so you can use the apparent intersect to snap to basically where the lines cross in 2D space. Okay, so one other way we can closely simulate snapping, to some degree, at least basically on endpoints and even moving objects around, is using grip edits. Now you'll probably have noticed by now when I click a line, you see these kind of blue squares pop up. Now if you hover over them, it kind of pulls you in and it gives you 2 options. You can stretch it or lengthen, but essentially if you just click on it, now you can move it around. So now you can move this corner or this endpoint around, keeping the other one docked. Now say I wanted to move it and snap it to here. Now I could shift right click, snap to this endpoint. Same thing over here, I can move this one around. But the nice thing with grips is, say if you highlight 2 lines and now I want to bring, say, this one, well, let's do a different line down here. So say I want to bring this endpoint to this endpoint. Instead of having to do an OSNAP, I can grab this grip and come over here and it automatically can snap to another grip as long as you have it highlighted. Okay, so that's a nice function of these. So same thing, I can come here, grab this grip and pull it down to that one. Sometimes that's helpful, and I'll show you in a second why it's especially helpful when we get into polylines. So again, we've just been dealing with lines so far. So I'm going to erase these. So what is a polyline? So let's just go back through our line command and say I just kind of drew and I continue drawing lines. So just, even if I drew a closed shape here, I'm going to snap to that endpoint. So this is a closed, some sort of polygon. But when you start highlighting, each segment is an individual line that is not linked. Okay, so even though this is a closed area, these are not linked together in any way. So if I wanted to change it, I'd have to move this, and then I could technically move this one. And so I will point out another thing about grip edits. If you highlight two things at the same time and they share a point or a vertex, if you click on it, it highlights both of them, and now you can move that object together. Okay, instead of having to move them one at a time. Okay, but say I drew a very similar feature or figure and I used a polyline. So for polylines, you type PL, and so it's either P line or polyline. And so I'm just going to draw something kind of similar to that. Now I can shift right click and go to the endpoint. Okay, now when I select this, it's one single feature, so it's all tied together. And this is whether it's closed or not, so I don't have to have it closed. It's still one single feature. Whereas again, our lines are individual segments and features. So if we wanted to grip edit within a polyline, we select, and again, now we can move each vertex together and change the shape. So it's much easier to work with polylines in that regard. And again, like if you had a longer, maybe an edge of a roadway or a toe cut line or something, that we can easily move these around and adjust that versus having to move individual lines here, move this one, and have to snap. Okay, so that would take quite a while. So polylines are really useful in a lot of ways. Now, one thing you can do, actually let me back up. So another way, when we closed our polyline the first time, we snapped to the original endpoint. But with polylines, you actually get a separate option. And so if you'll notice, you have a little cross here, and that's your origin point when you started the polyline. So if you look down here, you can specify next point, and there's a lot of different options. But one of them is close. So C for close. And if we hit that and hit enter, it actually closes our polyline. It automatically will snap back to the origin point and make this a closed object. So now we have a true polygon that is completely closed. Okay, so that's a handy feature, and so again, avoiding having to do any snapping. So there's a couple other basic things we can do with polylines, and I'll try to just quickly summarize those and cut this video off. But one thing, we can actually turn regular lines into polylines. So again, all of these are individual lines. So polylines have a separate command for editing them, and it's called p-edit. And so once you type p-edit, if you come down here to your command line, it'll say select the polyline you want to edit, or you can select multiple ones. So we're actually going to select multiple right now, and I'm going to select all of these individual lines, and I'll show you why in a minute. So then I right click, and it basically is telling me these aren't actually polylines. So would you like to convert these lines to polylines? And I'm going to say yes. So Y for yes. Now that they are polylines, I can actually edit them now. And so what I've done is I've actually converted these to polylines, but you really wouldn't know the difference because they're all still individual segments. So we're going to try this again. And I hit p-edit, and now again I still want to select multiple polylines, and I'm going to select this whole thing, And now there's this options. So the main options I use are join and width, and I'll explain width in a second, but it's essentially just a style to make them look wider. But I turned all of these individual line segments into polylines, but they're still individual short segments. What I'd like to do is join them together to make a single polyline that is this polygon shape. So I'm going to actually hit join here, and there's this fuzz distance, and basically that means if they're a little bit far away, we can close them up and join them together. But it's 0, we're going to leave that there. Hit enter, and then it still comes back to your menu, but we're done with that, so we're going to hit escape. And now you see what happens. I turn these individual line segments into a single polyline feature that now we can edit the same way we can as any polyline. Okay, so I think that's going to be it for today, or for this lesson. So thanks for watching.